Okay, so I'm Dr. Deb Carlson. I work at the University of Texas Medical Branch, and I want to talk to you today about what I'm going to call hearing enhancements. Part one is going to be amplification, and in about another week, we're going to do part two, which will be Osseo integrated device evals. And the reason I like to call it this is hearing loss is a very negative connotation. And with hearing aids, because hearing loss is negative, people think hearing aids are a sign of aging, or it's a sign of admitting that they're not perfect, whatever. So I really like to try to focus the message more positively. So again, I'm at the University of Texas Medical Branch. I am employed by the University of Texas Medical Branch, so that's my only financial disclosure. I do have to pay my mortgage. So I'm going to talk to you today. I'm going to outline the talk in 5 different ways. First, we're going to talk a little bit about market penetration. And we're going to do that through some of the MarkeTrak data, which is a survey that's been going on for about 30 years with the Hearing Industry Association. And it actually helps give the pulse of hearing healthcare market. It kind of talks about hearing aid use, the penetration of the market, hearing aid adoption, satisfaction, the whole consumer journey through the process. Then we're going to go into candidacy and who would we determine should have a hearing aid, and what factors do we consider in picking out or selecting the features that they need in a hearing aid. Then how we verify and validate the fitting, and then what's the future for hearing aids, because we have some new things coming up for that. So first we'll go to the MarkeTrak 10. So MarkeTrak 10 was in 2018, and it's done every 4 years, as I mentioned. If you are interested in looking at other MarkeTrak data, go to the betterhearing.org site. It's a great site. It's the Hearing Industry Association's consumer site, and they give you a ton of information. You can go back and look at all the 30 years of different articles that have gone through. But what you see in MarkeTrak 10 is that it still is about 12 years from the time people know that or in the survey, I'm sorry, the average person in the survey had 12 years of knowledge that they had a hearing loss. Those that were hearing aid owners were about 14.6. Those that did not adopt hearing aids were about 10 years. So the other interesting thing here is that if you look at, once you know you have a hearing loss, how many years does it take you to start thinking about using a hearing device? And you can say it takes about 4.5 years to get their first visit with a hearing health professional, and about another few months to get the actual hearing aids, and then some of them got a second hearing aid a little bit later. And so we're now, of that group, they were now in their second hearing aid. So that's actually better than it's been in the past, because it used to be about 6 or 7 years from the time people knew they had a hearing loss to where they would actually pursue a hearing aid or some form of amplification. So this is another interesting thing. Here we go back to the first MarkeTrak all the way over to the current MarkeTrak 10. And you see a few things. One is the hearing aid adoption rate. And the hearing aid adoption rate, they couldn't get it past 23% for years. And then in 2014, they actually got it up to about 30% and about 34% in 2018. So one thing that you do have to keep in mind is these were from 1989 to 2008, they were all paper pencil tests. In 2014 and 2018, it went to an online survey. So they had a little bit higher participation rate, and they may have gotten a little bit different personnel in there. However, when you look at, there's still about a 4% increase from 2014, the other online surveys. So it's definitely increased from there. Next thing you want to look at is the first time buyer rate. And you'll see that it was actually about over 50% in the first survey, and then it dropped, and it kind of has gone up and down, but it has gotten higher the last 2 surveys as well, and has now gone over 50%, so around 56, 58%. The other thing I want to point out is 1994. So you'll kind of see a dip there. And that dip is related to the FDA in 1994 actually told the, or slapped the hands of manufacturers for advertising speech and noise. And anybody who was around then, that you used to see these commercials on TV, and those commercials would have someone in a restaurant really loud, they couldn't hear anything, and then they got their new hearing aid and it was just quiet as could be in the background. And they had this nice conversation, and we all know that's not true. And what the FDA did is they said that they had to pull, the manufacturers had to pull all of their advertisement unless they actually had data to support that was true. And so when they did that, it actually didn't, you'll see it actually in 97 again, the first time buyer rate was up. What it did though is the demand did continue some, but the supply was reduced because the manufacturers now had to start funding randomized clinical trials in order to be able to fill out the paperwork to support the claims and advertise what the noise circuits would do. So they did recover from that pretty nicely. The other thing that will occur is that hearing aid demand does through the years flourish in good economies and it decreases in recessions. So that's just something that will always happen. So then the last part that's really exciting is if you look here on overall satisfaction. So it was actually pretty high amongst hearing aid users, 60%, I mean, it was over half. It dropped down for a few years, and then it steadily climbed, and now the satisfaction rate is over 80%. So overall, the people that are wearing hearing aids are pretty satisfied with them. We can look at this in another few ways. In the 2018 survey, or MarkeTrak 10, 92% were satisfied using their hearing aids in the workplace. And when you compare that to 5 years ago, even, it was like 65%. So that has gone up quite a bit. 8% of hearing aid users, or only 8% of hearing aid users, are dissatisfied with the sound quality. So overall, they're pretty satisfied with what's going on. And in the last, if you compare technology today to technology 5 years ago, they've seen a 7% improvement in following conversation and noise. So they report that they can follow conversation better in a background of noise now than what was reported 5 years ago. So here's another way to look at this. And this is looking at how satisfied they are with the providers of their hearing care purchase. So they're very satisfied, 93% total, with the quality of service during the fitting period. The professionalism of the practitioner, the quality of service after the purchase, and the level of organization and efficiency of the practice. Still very satisfied with support, staff assistance, the sophistication of the equipment and the whole process, and the quality of the counseling. Where it drops down a little bit as expected is purchase policies, financing, trial, guarantee, etc., and the selection of the hearing aids carried. When you look at this, that's the total percentages. Hearing aid owners, of course, are people who during that survey currently are wearing hearing aids. Non-owners would be people that did pursue seeing a hearing aid provider and either didn't purchase after they did the initial evaluations or purchased and returned the hearing aid. So they're non-users. But all in all, very good satisfaction. Then we can look at just what do they think about the product itself. Oops. And the product itself, they're also pretty satisfied. The highest rating is overall with product quality and ease of use. A lot of the automaticity that's in hearing aids these days really helps with that. They can, in the first program, it can simulate anywhere from 3 to 8, 9 programs, depending on what model and circuit you're in. They're pretty happy with the appearance of it. Sound quality, the effort required for maintenance, pretty low. Comfort of it, effectiveness of the enhanced features. The value again is where it gets a little bit lower, but it's still well over 70%. And out-of-pocket price paid, of course, would fall in there. So if we think about all those things and we think about hearing aids and we think, okay, how do we determine if they're a candidate for hearing aids? So they have a hearing loss, they're a candidate, right? Well, maybe. So let's just, if we look at these 3 audiograms, here's one, and this person has just a high frequency hearing loss, a mild high frequency hearing loss right here at 4 and 8,000 hertz. The left ear though, they have a little bit more hearing loss. It drops down a little bit sooner in the speech range. So do we fit that person with a hearing aid? Do they need a hearing aid? Well, we'll talk about what we would consider to determine those factors. And I would say that we will have some people that have that hearing loss that would not be candidates, and we'd have other people that would, and we'll talk about that more as we go. Now this one's kind of a no-brainer. It's pretty easy. We have an upward sloping hearing loss. You can see that that's in the severe hearing loss range, moving up to mild. And obviously that person is missing a lot of conversation. Here's normal conversation right in here. And so you can see they're missing a lot and obviously would most likely be a candidate, This one, what about this one? This one has pretty normal hearing in the left ear, and the right ear, they definitely have a hearing loss, sensory neural. Would they be a candidate? Well, it's noise induced. It looks like it's got a nice classic noise notch on it. And yeah, they probably would be, but we need to consider some other factors. And what do we do when they have a normal ear? We do some things with the fitting to still try to give them a good bilateral experience. So the hearing aid evaluation itself, I kind of divided into 3 sections. This is all in the same hour, but we're really looking at 3 different aspects. First, the hearing loss characteristics. So we've learned the degree, the configuration, the nature of the loss, and their word recognition from the audio that's been done before the hearing aid evaluation. And some people combine those 2 evaluations. I don't really recommend it because you're going to see how much you learn in the hearing aid evaluation process, and that extra hour spent is going to lead to much higher satisfaction and selecting the right product for them. What we're going to do though for assessing the hearing loss characteristics is some tolerance testing. So we're going to put them in the booth, we're going to talk to them, and we're going to give them some tones, and we're going to look at where is speech comfortable and where is it where's it too loud, where they couldn't listen to it for more than a minute. We don't want it to be that they wouldn't want to listen at that level, but that they couldn't listen for more than a minute. And we have a sound loudness chart that has 7 steps on it, so they're all classifying it with the same descriptors. Very soft, comfortable, but slightly soft, comfortable but slightly loud but okay, and uncomfortably loud. So we're using that to determine, so they're talking to us, they're telling us how it is, they're judging it. We're at the same time making sure it makes sense with their audiogram and things like that, because sometimes you have to push people a little bit and some people try to be heroes. But that's not what we want, because we really want that loudness discomfort level or uncomfortable loudness level, because we want to know that the hearing aid's not going to exceed that. And then the other test that's really important to do is speech and noise. And you know, someone might say they do terrible in noise. In the test, they probably feel they do terrible, and some do okay, and some do terrible. So you have to kind of look at that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. For lifestyle, you want to know how motivated are they? Are they being brought in by a family member? Their wife is telling them to come in, or their daughter or son are telling them they can't hear, but they're not really ready. What difficulties are they having? What goals would they have for the hearing aid? If they're a current hearing aid user and they're thinking about a new hearing aid, we especially want to know what their goals are. What do they like best about their current hearing aid? What do they like least about it? We're going to look at a hearing handicap scale so that we can look at how is their hearing loss impacting on their lifestyle. We want to know about any physical constraints. That could be uncorrected visual problems. That could be a frozen shoulder or a stroke where they can't reach up to their ear I like to have them reach up to both sides. Doesn't mean we can't fit them. It means we have to take that into consideration. I also like to know how's their fine motor and what's their sense of touch like. I'll take my fingernail and I'll just press real lightly on the fingertips. And if they can feel that, they should be able to feel the program button or any other button that we may want them to use, or to feel the edge of that battery compartment. Another thing we want to know is about comorbidities. So, do they have any skin allergies, such as to latex or something? Because that may affect if we order an ear mold, the material that we use for ear molds, it may affect something that we do with the hearing aid itself or some features. A big one is diabetes. And if they're diabetic, I don't want to just know they have diabetes. I want to know that is it controlled? How is it controlled? Is it controlled by diet? Is it controlled by medication? Is it controlled by insulin? When was the last time it was out of control? And that's just going to help me understand about potential skin breakdown and potential additional hearing loss, or not fluctuations, but additional hearing loss they may have. We might want to know about cardiac episodes. We do want to know if they have a pacemaker. Not so important right now with current technology, but we have had technology in the past that definitely affected it. So many years ago, with a completely in the canal hearing aid, one manufacturer came up with a way to make a volume control. And what they did is they put a magnet in, and they had a little stick that you could hold up to it, and you could just tap it on it or tap it near it, and the magnetic field was what was raising and lowering the volume. Well, that did interfere with pacemakers, so you had to make sure you didn't put it on a patient with a pacemaker. As we started getting some programming cables that would go around the neck, some of those, if you had somebody that was, I had a gentleman that was a very large man, and he had a large chest, and the device sat out and it sat right over the pacemaker, and I could never connect him wirelessly. And we had to kind of move it off to the side. It didn't interfere with the pacemaker, but you just want to know that as new technology comes about, if there is anything that might interfere, it's not something you would necessarily think about unless you make yourself ask about it on the hearing aid evaluation. So those are a few of them. Then I always say, is there any general medication, any general health conditions I should know about? So I don't necessarily ask them about Meniere's, but they might say I have Meniere's disease. Well, then I want to kind of know how much is it fluctuating? And hopefully I have a little history of it, but oftentimes not. And then the big one is phone use and their difficulty, and we'll talk a little bit more later. Then the last part of that hour is spent in the selection of the device. So we're going to talk about the style, which style is best for them. Do they have any preconceived notions on that? What features do we want to do? And that's going to be based on the lifestyle and hearing loss characteristics that we've already determined. What technology level are we going to need to fit their hearing loss? How are we going to couple the hearing aid to the ear? Are we going to use disposable domes, or are we going to use custom ear molds? And there's pros and cons to both. What kind of accessories might we need? And then I'm going to spend a little time on the financial aspect. It's important in the hearing aid evaluation, but I think it's also important for everybody to understand where there is and isn't coverage and things that they do need to consider in referring or telling the patient they need a hearing aid. So first, let's talk about the hearing loss characteristics. So we went down the list of things that we're doing to get those characteristics, but what are we using them for? Well, so things like the frequency range of the hearing loss. Let's say we have a hearing loss that is restricted to greater than 2000 hertz. So it's just very high frequency. Well, what I know about that already is that I'm going to have to get a extended bandwidth on my receiver, on my hearing aid. So I'm probably going to be in a receiver in the ear. And I know there's only a few manufacturers that give that to me. And there's most manufacturers that give it to me only give it in the highest level. And some people give it in all levels. So it just varies, but you need to be aware of that, because if you don't give them extended high frequencies, they're really only going to get amplification at about 2, 3, a little bit at 4, maybe not much really at all at 6, and they're not going to notice the difference. So the caveats or the inconvenience about the hearing aid, they got to clean it, they have to take it in and out, they have to change the battery or charge the battery. And sometimes if you're not giving them enough amplification, they're going to feel like this isn't worth it. They're going to reject it. So you have to know going into it that you've got to have that extended high frequency response. Next is a steeply sloping hearing loss. So is the hearing loss so severe in the high frequencies that we're not going to be able to amplify that? So what can we do about it? Well, we have some frequency lowering strategies that we can do with that. Severity in the speech frequency, how severe is it? What will we be looking at? Excuse me. Next is it conductive hearing loss or sensory neural? So a couple tips there is conductive hearing loss always requires more gain because they are losing the presence of sound or excuse me, the loudness of sound. And sensory neural is going to be more sensitive. They may have recruitment, so they may be sensitive to sound or we're sensitive to sound. Next is configuration and reduced word recognition. So we mentioned about the steeply sloping hearing loss, but maybe it's such that it doesn't affect their word recognition. So then I probably don't want to use frequency lowering, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But let's say that they do have reduced word recognition. So it's in the, really I say at least below 80, then I might consider frequency lowering. And we'll talk about what that does. Other thing is when they have that reduced dynamic range, so remember that we're talking about the difference between where sound is audible and where sound is uncomfortable or discomfort. And so that's that dynamic range. Well, when you have hearing loss, that reduces down. And so when we have that happen, we need to consider having more channels so that when, excuse me, when we are reducing some of the gain at certain frequencies where they're more sensitive, the more we can limit it to those specific frequencies, the better we can amplify them. And when we do that tolerance testing, it's important to do it both with speech and with tones, because speech doesn't really tell you that much. It tells you that yes, they may have a reduced tolerance for sound, but what frequency is it occurring at? That's going to be most helpful. Okay, and then next is severity. Oops. Am I on still?
Yes, you're good.
Is severity of the signal to noise ratio loss. So we talked about speech and noise, which we'll talk about more, and that affects the microphone we're going to pick. So in what technology, how much do we have to depend on the microphone to help them in that speech and noise situation as compared to what their brain and their ear is doing. So now let's talk about that speech and noise testing. So there's lots of tests out there. There's something called the QuickSyn. There's the HINT hearing and noise test, the BKB-SYN. The AZ Bio is a sentence test, BKB-SYN is a sentence test, and they all have noise, mostly people talking in the background, which is better than just white noise or something, or narrow or pink speech noise. So the most popular one that you'll see out there, it's an easy, quick one to do, is called the QuickSyn, and it's going to look for the signal to noise ratio loss. So what does that mean? That means that how much above the background noise does the speaker have to be in order for the listener to understand about half of what is said. So in this case, you're hearing sentences, it's a female talker, and there's 4 people talking in the background. So it's a lot of speech babble in the background. And it's going to do it at signal to noise ratios. The first sentence is going to be at plus 25, then plus 25, then plus 20, 15, 10, 0 until the speech and the background is the same level. And you can do it in the sound field or ear specific. I prefer the sound field for the simple fact that that's how they're listening with hearing aids. And if they were having trouble with their hearing aids and binaural hearing aids, there's some times that I might need to go in and try to figure out, is it one ear that's causing the problem? But generally the sound field gives me enough, and it's a real listening situation. And you'll see the sentences are things like the lake sparkled in the red hot sun. So each sentence has 5 target words that they need to get. Doesn't matter if they miss the or in, whatever. They have to get those 5. And then that gives us the signal to noise ratio loss. So if I told them that they had a signal to noise ratio loss of 5, that means that it's mild, and the normal hearing listener needs 2. And they need 5. So they need twice as much as the normal hearing listener. Sometimes I like to give them, if it's a grandparent or something, and I say, if you went into your granddaughter's classroom, it has about a 6 dB signal to noise ratio. You would have trouble hearing in that situation. A restaurant might be about a +3. So that's the quick sin. So then let's talk about the lifestyle. And one of my favorites is to use the IDA circle tool. The line tool can be helpful. I don't use it that often, but the circle tool is a trans-theoretical model of their readiness to address their their health concern, in this case, their hearing loss. We'll go over it a little bit more in just a minute. Want to know their realistic goals. And so if they're a new user, what is it they want to get out of the hearing aid? And as I mentioned earlier, if they're a current user, I really want to know, what do you like best about your current hearing aid? Because I better incorporate that into your new hearing aid. And what do you like least? So where does it fall short? Because I have to know if today's current technology is going to help that yet, or if you need to wait a little bit because it's not there. It's not going to do what you're needing it to do. Next, we talked about physical, gross, and fine motor skills, the sense of touch, visual deficits, the comorbidities for signs of fluctuating hearing or progressive hearing loss, skin conditions, things like that. And then with the phone ear, so we want to know first, are you using cell or landline? Because those have their own unique sets of difficulties. And do you use a caption phone, because that's readily available if that's something that would be beneficial. But also, are you having difficulty? So that person that has that high frequency hearing loss, they probably aren't having much difficulty if they have normal hearing in the low frequencies, because the signal in the over the telephone is really around 300 to maybe 2,500, 3,000. So it's really more low frequency loaded. Then we want to know, so how do you do? We want to know which ear do you use on the phone. And then today, we can't do a hearing aid evaluation without knowing what kind of cell phone you have. And if it's Bluetooth or a smartphone, I should really say, is it an iPhone or an Android? And the reason is that iPhones have the best compatibility with hearing aids. And that's because Apple went to hearing aid manufacturers about probably 7, 8 years ago now, maybe more, and said they've always been an accessibility company. They wanted to be more accessible to the hearing impaired user. And so what different companies did is some came up with an app that worked with an iPhone. Resound was the first one that came up with their hearing aid that could directly connect to the iPhone. And it then could use the microphone of the iPhone as a remote microphone. So it's a function called Live Listen. When you connect a telephone to your Bluetooth and to your iPhone, and you go to your home screen, you can press something called Live Listen, and it now allows you to stream the person you're trying to hear over the phone via Bluetooth into your hearing aid. So if you're at Starbucks and you're having trouble hearing because it's very noisy, you can slide your phone across the table in Live Listen mode, and now you're going to get much less of that background noise because instead you're streaming the voice of the person you're talking to. So Android has streaming capabilities for 2 of the hearing aid companies right now. The companies have apps that still function with the Android, but for the phone right now it's 2. And that's for a couple reasons. One is iPhone, there's a delay in the Bluetooth, and iPhone, Apple has a patent that got rid of the delay for theirs. And for the Android, getting rid of that delay for binaural hearing is difficult. When it streams to both ears on the iPhone, which is very convenient. For the Android, what the companies that came out with it, what they did is it connects to one ear. So you have to designate in the software that I'm going to make the right ear the phone ear. It's going to connect Bluetooth to the Android, to the right ear, the hearing aid on the right ear if that's what you choose. And then it's going to wirelessly send the sound over to the hearing aid on the left ear. So they will still hear binaurally, but it doesn't stream binaurally. It's not a huge problem if you have a situation where, it's not a huge problem because it's still streaming, but if you have a situation where that right ear goes out, now you lose the phone unless you come in. When you come in, we have to switch it to the left ear so you can do that. The advantage they did though is what they bought with that is they can, if they have those 2 companies and they use that function with their Android, it's truly hands-free. Their Android can be 40, 60 feet away, depending on what else is in the area. And they can press the button on their hearing aid, the program or volume button. They can press that and that will answer the call and hang up on the call. So there's the trade-off for that. iPhone does not have that capability and you're using your iPhone for the mic. It just simply has to be within about 24, 30 inches and you'll get a pretty good signal on that. So then this is the circle tool. And again, what this does, it's really nice, is you're looking at what cycle are they coming in at and how do I deal with that? So for example, you have them read some sentences that are related to hearing aids. If they say, I am not ready for hearing aids at this time, they were dragged in by their spouse or their daughter or son, and they said, I'm just not ready. So that means they're in this pre-contemplation stage here. They haven't even entered the area where they're ready to do something about it. So we just have to know, hey, it's pretty sketchy. We have to give them some education and some basic information and not push too hard, just try to help them understand through the testing what the hearing aid may or may not do. Let's say they're here and they say, no, I've already started to seek information about hearing aids. Well, they're in the preparation phase. So I really just need to give them some advice, but all of these are still related to attitude. So I have to get them to have a positive attitude and encourage them to get into this action maintenance I'm going to do something about it behavioral stage. Or they might say, I'm comfortable with the idea of wearing hearing aids. I've already researched it some. And then I know, great. So they're in the maintenance. I know we just simply have to pick out the right product for them and, get them into that process and get them on their way. So it can be a very helpful to have that. What I found before I knew about this tool is all of my hearing aid evaluations were very rote. I said the same thing to everybody. So, now I tailor what I say based on where they are in that process. Another tool, I haven't used this as much, but I like to have it in my toolbox. And if you have that person that's in that pre-contemplation stage, you can say, how important is it for you to improve your hearing right now? Just point on this visual analog scale, point to how important it is to you. And they say, it's not. And then another good question is, how much do you believe in your ability to use hearing aids? Because maybe they say, well, I'm here. They really would like to improve their hearing, but they're really afraid of the hearing devices. They just don't think I'm not technical at all. I don't think I can handle it. So the line tool can be very helpful to you as well. So the hearing handicap questionnaires, there's a ton of them out there. And they're basically questionnaires that assess the impact of the hearing loss on the patient's lifestyle. It may be self-filled out for adults. They're mainly self-completed. If it's a child, there's maybe filled out by the parent. So if it's a very young child who's just developing, their auditory milestones in listening and speech, the parent's going to answer. Some of them just have something like a yes, no. Some of them, they give situations and they say, do they respond to this or not? Others have some situations and you say, you know, like, how often do they do such and such? And you just kind of go through that with them. Then there's some that when they're a little bit older that the child can fill out and say how, it's called the child, and they can say, how do they do? And there's like a thermometer that says how hard is it for them to do this. And you have the child fill it out and you have the parent fill it out and you kind of compare. And so that's a really helpful one when you get some adolescents. And then there's scales that the teacher fills out to help you understand how much difficulty are they having in the classroom, what needs to be addressed there. And so what's helpful with those is if you do it pre and post hearing aid fitting, you're going to validate that hearing aid benefit. So there's your validation, a subjective way of knowing that the hearing aid is benefiting the person. And it is especially helpful when they're trying to decide, am I going to keep the hearing aid if they're over the fence, or they think, well, I don't know how well I did. You're now able to show them in their own selections what the benefit was. So next is, I'm just going to go over just one scale, just real briefly, and this is a very commonly used scale. It's called Hearing Handicap Scale. There's a version for adults and one for elderly. There's like a 2-question difference. The most common use of it is to use the 10-question screening measure. And it explores the effects of the hearing loss on the emotional and social adjustment to their hearing loss. So here's 2 emotional questions. One is, does a hearing problem cause you to feel embarrassed when meeting new people? All the time, sometimes, or not at all? Another one is, does a hearing problem cause you to feel frustrated when talking to members of your family? 2 of the social situational questions are, does a hearing problem cause you difficulty when visiting friends, relatives, or neighbors? And another is, does a hearing problem cause you to attend religious services less often than you would like? And so you total it up and you can see, is there difficulties evenly spaced between the emotional component, so how it makes them feel, how they feel about themselves, and situational, or is it more situational and they've really adapted to their hearing loss very well? Or is it mostly emotionally how they're feeling about the hearing loss? And that again helps you with some of your counseling that you need to do with them to help them accept the hearing aid. So that's this one happens to be the hearing handicap inventory for the elderly. So then let's talk about the last part. Now we're selecting the style and the features and technology and everything else. So we have to consider, one, monaural or binaural. So we saw that one audiogram that we said, well, they really don't have a hearing loss in the left ear. We are fitting the hearing loss in the right ear. We're going to fit it with one hearing aid, but we also want to kind of make sure that we gain localization and we watch that we're kind of matching those ears as close as we can for that hearing loss. The style, the dexterity, again, the severity of loss and cosmetic issues, and I'll talk about that in a second when we look at the style slide. What features? So if they have a really severe signal to noise ratio loss, I know that I need some pretty fancy automatic microphones that's going to help direct them to the sound they want to hear. So the people talking, they're over on the right side or someone comes up behind them. I need those microphones to be constantly searching for that and switching because they are lost in that high noise level situation. And I also need to consider noise reduction strategies. So some of the basic hearing aids, the kind of low level hearing aids, a lot of those require you to manually change a program to get your noise reduction. Well, if you have a signal to noise ratio loss, I have to have the microphone working for you at the same time as the noise reduction is reducing the noise. So I have to have the microphone focus you as the circuit's reducing the noise. So I really need to put you in a higher level hearing aid, at least a mid-level to do that. And there's a lot of good mid-level hearing aids. Some companies have 4 levels, some have 3, but there's a lot of good technology out there, and that's the technology level. And then we talked about smartphone and type, and then wireless accessories and streamers. And I try not to put anyone in accessories if they're a new user initially, like say a Bluetooth device for their TV. Instead, I try to help them work with what they have and see what the hearing aid will do first, because again, the least cumbersome we can make it, the more accepting they are of that hearing aid. So let's talk about the styles briefly. We have lots of styles. So what's called the in the ear range all the way from what they call invisible in the ear to completely in the canal, to in the canal, and then the in the ear, it fits the whole concha or it fits half the concha for the half shell. That's the half shell. Then we have a receiver in the ear, and that basically sits on top of the ear. They used to sit behind the ear, but it sits on top of the ear. And that's pretty important because what we want is, there's two microphones here. There's one here and and one back here on the other part of the instrument. So like if we're looking at this, they're here and here. So if it's sitting on top of the ear, they're sitting in a horizontal plane. So they're measuring, the front mic is focusing on sound from the front and the back mic is focusing on sound or speech from the back. That's how we want it. If you put it too far behind the ear, you're now focusing sound toward the ceiling and toward the floor, and most people don't listen in those planes. So it's really important that this is fit appropriately and not sitting too far behind. But it also causes some challenges when they're learning to put it on, because they have to learn to not put it behind because they won't have enough room to get this in. So they have to focus on putting it on top and then putting it in. Then we have mini behind the ear hearing aids. And those are also known as an open fit, where it's a slim tube. So there's no receiver taking up space in the canal. It's a very thin tube. And those are fine if you have normal hearing in the low frequencies. So my cutoff is if they have more than 25 or 30 in through 750, I will do a receiver in the ear. I won't consider. But sometimes you have a patient who has a collapsing ear canal or a very small ear canal that can't be surgically modified. And that's an option for them. Sometimes you have to just some manufacturers make just a little tiny sleeve tube that you can put on that so that it really won't take up much space. And then, you know, your traditional behind the ear with Earmolds. And those are all pretty small and attractive these days. But with the cosmetics, if someone says, oh, I want this completely in the canal because I don't want people to see it. Well, look at this. Which one do you see more? You know, so it's really kind of deceiving. The receiver in the ear is very invisible. I have fun with the color selections. When they pick the color, most companies have good colors and some have really fun colors. So I tell them they can pick any color they want, except if it is a company that has that medical beige and they pick that one, I say, except that one, it's too medical looking. So when I make that face and I tell them it's too medical looking, they usually say, oh, that's true. I'm like, Band-Aids are that color, you know, and so I said, we just have to get rid of that. And we need something nicer looking. So most people will try to match their hair, but there's a lot of people out there that'll just pick a fun favorite color. So then of course, that hearing aid is nothing without us coupling the sound and directing the sound to the ear. So we have several ear mold styles that we consider when we have traditional hearing aids. And that's where the configuration of the hearing loss, the severity of the hearing loss, those things will come into play. We'll also have to consider the condition of the ear. If there's somebody that has a lot of fungus infections or things like that, we have to do some cleaning routines and we have to consider keeping it as open as we can. The receiver in the ears, they can have just a dome, and it's called a disposable ear mold. And they come in closed sizes. They have openings so that you can keep it more open and let the low frequencies back out of the ear canal so you're not over amplifying those. They come in small, medium, larges, or sometimes numbered sizes. When they have more hearing loss, you have a double dome so it prevents that sound from leaking out. You're going to keep that sound directed. There's tulip domes. There's all kinds. We can also put that receiver into a little sleeve mold that looks like this hollow shell. So we have many options. And again, acoustically, and if there's somebody who's very active and they're worried about it's going to come out, etc., we can also put a little retention piece on the side to help it stay down into the concha bowl. So this is one of my favorite things, frequency lowering. And the first frequency lowering was AVR Sonovation. They were a company out of Israel. And they realized that these are the profoundly hearing impaired kids, that they had vibrotactile, but then they also learned that they could reach a part of the cochlea that had less distortion if they used strategies to duplicate that information. There was another one out of France. We did a little bit of work with that, and it was called the Emily, and it was named after the first person that wore the device. And they had frequency transposition where it took the incoming signal, it multiplied it and made it 1 octave higher, 1 octave lower, and the original. So it produced a chord in the cochlea along the basilar membrane. And so we had about a 50-50 success rate. We were just doing it with profoundly hearing, or severe to profound hearing aid kids in the schools. And they either liked it or they didn't. And we kind of felt like if they didn't like it, it was their auditory set. They couldn't deal with the extra. But if they liked it, sometimes it was just because we had a teenager who he could hear the flutter of the poster on his ceiling when he was listening through his Emily, but he couldn't hear it otherwise. And he just felt more aware. And as a teenager, he spent a lot of time in his room. He also liked listening to music. It was more pleasurable for him. But now we have different ways. So we later learned that it wasn't just those profound hearing loss cases that would benefit. In fact, it's like ski slope hearing losses. So just really briefly, it's now called frequency lowering. The first way was frequency transposition. And what frequency transposition does is here you have some sound, then above this cutoff point, above this point, you're not going to be able to amplify it. The hearing loss is too great. So what you do is you take the information that comes in there and you bring it down and you overlay it in an area of the audiogram where they can hear, and then they now hear those sounds. Another way of doing that is what's called frequency compression. And you're taking that, and notice you're not superimposing it, you're not laying it over, you're just compressing it into a narrower band. So they used to have, the one company that first came out with this, they came up with a graphic that they had four people sitting on a couch, and now they crunched them down into a love seat, versus their claim was in frequency transposition, somebody has to sit on somebody's lap. So it was a cute graphic. What I tend to like is for high frequency hearing losses, I like frequency transposition. When it's a severe hearing loss, a corner or something where I want to give it, I tend to like frequency compression when it's a flatter hearing loss. But then they also have what's called frequency translation. And what that does is it, above the cutoff, it takes some sound and then it also goes a certain percentage lower. I don't know that it's a full octave. I think you may even be able to set it. So that's another way. And different companies have slightly different names for this, but this is basically what's happening with frequency lowering. So here's something, if you look at real ear verification, and this is, and we'll look at this real quickly, and I see I'm kind of getting low on time, but you'll see that this, if you haven't seen this, this is normal hearing, okay? This is intensity from soft to loud, so just opposite of the audiogram, and here's your frequencies along the bottom. So the normal hearing person is gonna be right in here. This is the person's left ear hearing loss. So again, it's inverted from the audiogram. And this is average speech signal. So this is a speech signal at an average level. And you can see that everything above the line, this person is going to hear. What's below the line, they may hear bits and pieces, but they're not going to hear all of it, because you can see that spectrum goes pretty low, but they have some that overlap. So what you're doing is when you have some of the high frequency sounds like sh, you're not going to get that energy. So they take that, and once we shift it, then that sound is occurring over here. And so now they are getting those sounds, which carry a lot of meaning in speech. To tell the difference between fed, ted, said, and shed, you have to have those consonants, not the vowels. So that's one of my favorite things. It's not used a lot, and some of the companies have come up with some ingenious ways where it's sort of automatically applied when it's when they think the algorithm detects in the hearing loss that they need something like that. And then of course you can turn it off. Other big thing, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I just want to tell you, when I mentioned signal to noise ratio, I talked about we need the microphone. We need a fancier microphone when they have a greater signal to noise ratio loss, because the microphone, along with the noise reduction, is going to have to help where their brain and their ear is not handling that well. So you have the traditional omnidirectional hearing microphones that you're used to. It's always circling, it's listening all around you. And then you have directional, and you can have it as simple as the omnidirectional, and then directional fixes it in front of you. And sometimes I still put in a fixed program at times because they're having some difficulties, and I won't go into, there's times the microphone can get confused in really noisy situations. So it's nice to have that fixed to drop back to if your automatic program isn't fitting the bill. But there's adaptive directionality where it automatically switches and it changes polar patterns. There's split band directionality where it goes directional in the high frequencies and omnidirectional in the low frequencies all at the same time. There's array mics where you've got the mics working together and working in sequence and doing some beam forming to help you identify. Sometimes the microphones are talking to each other to help with directionality and spatial cues. There's free focus where on an app they can say, I want my hearing aids to just all go, my microphones to go to the right. So you're driving down the highway, you're getting a lot of wind noise, you're having trouble hearing your passenger. You can focus everything to the right and not hear that wind noise, as much wind noise there. Or focus to the back and you don't hear as much road noise in that. Or you're just sitting in a meeting and someone's being really noisy with paper on the side. So you can change that. Then you have remote microphones, which are going to connect. They're going to stream either through a streamer that the patient has or directly to the hearing aids, or like we said, iPhone has live listen. So there's many, these are not even everything because there's a lot of proprietary ones that are variations of these, but it just shows you that the technology is there to help a lot. And that's why that QuickSim, that speech and noise testing, is really, really helpful in hearing aid evals. So now, some of the other features, like I mentioned a little bit already, we have direct connect to iPhone. It is binaural and we can use the phone as a remote mic. We have direct connect to Android. It is still it uses wireless transmission to the other ear, but it is truly hands-free. They can just hit the button on their hearing aid. There's apps to help with hearing aid control. Those apps sometimes help them find their hearing aids, like the Find My Phone function. It helps customize programs, so their hearing aid does pretty well, but they always go to this one restaurant and they're having difficulty. And they're going to frequent it, so they can actually adjust it, and then they can save it as their own program. And every time they go out in that restaurant, they just have to hit that again. There's more and more opportunity for remote programming, especially with this COVID situation. Remote is the thing, and a lot of people are starting to unroll stuff that they didn't quite have. Maybe they were going to at the convention, who knows, but they're starting to unroll more. You have streaming accessories, some of them direct connect. A TV connector can direct connect to the hearing aid, or it may have to go through a streamer. On rechargeability, we have rechargeable that are truly lithium ion. So we don't have the silver type oxide type battery that was going to last for 15, 18 months and you had to pay an extra $300 per hearing aid to get the retrofit case. And then you got to tell your patient in 12 or 15 months that they're going to have to buy a new battery. They're starting to have a couple of the companies have activity and health tracking on their apps that are attached to the phone. And then one company's had this for a little while. It's called If This Then That. And it's where the hearing aid can connect to other wireless or other streaming devices, other devices in your home, like you could connect it with Alexa or your coffee pot if it's got a plug-in that's appropriate. So this is the financial aspects, and I'll do this just really quickly. The only reason I bring this up is this is what's unfortunately is generally hearing aids are not covered by insurance. The Affordable Care Act some states have a benefit in the essential health benefits section in order to provide that be on the exchange and provide that insurance, but it's very variable and it doesn't usually cover the whole thing. Medicare specifically excludes it. Some of the Part C plans, so those Medicare Advantage plans, some of them have it. Some of them the patient has to check vision or hearing, and so that varies. About 20 states offer Medicaid coverage for hearing aids for adults. Most of those are monaural programs. Private insurance, there are 18 states that if you're writing a policies in the state, you're going to have some coverage for hearing aids of children. And 5 states require it for both children and adults, an additional 5. The coverages are variable. It's typically defined as, 1 hearing aid every 3, 4, 5 years up to X dollars. It's just individually done. And that benefit may or may not be subject to deductibles or coinsurance. And I think the reason I bring this up is it's really easy when you're seeing a patient and you say, oh, go see audiology for a hearing aid, you need a hearing aid, but they may not have the benefit if they're Medicaid, and they may have to meet the criteria audiometrically. So it's a little bit of a sticky fine line to walk. You shouldn't say they don't need a hearing aid, but it's helpful if they know a little bit ahead that, hey, this may or may not be something that'll work, and maybe they can have some family members help or something. But hearing aid fitting, I'm gonna just, we do some pre-fit work. We have to select a dome size. We said acoustically, the Earmold plumbing does affect it, and so we have to set that up in the software. The hearing aids have a good feedback suppression, and so some of them involve a feedback test where you're setting the microphone to learn how much sound is leaking out that's coming from the hearing aid and getting re-amplified, causing feedback, and that sets it up to suppress it. This is what I want to talk to you about, the verification. So probe mic measurements, this is one particular equipment commonly used. The patient is sitting here. You're going to put a little probe down in the ear canal close to the eardrum. Then you're going to slip the hearing aid in. There's a microphone here, and then there's a speaker here, and they're sitting in front of it. Usually, sometimes you might do a test that's off to the side, and they're going to listen to different types of signals. It can be speech. It can be something called LTAS, which is like a noise that is similar to speech spectrum noise. And you're going to ask them to judge loudness, or you're going to see if it meets certain targets for some prescribed formulas. This is just what we're looking at. We looked at it a little bit before. This is a normal hearing person. Here's where you have normal speech and energy. The normal hearing person has uncomfortable levels up here. So this is their dynamic range. This is their hearing range. This is where you want to make sound modify to fit in there. So you have a person with a hearing loss here, and it looks like they have a moderate to a severe hearing loss. Because remember, this is upside down. Here's their uncomfortable levels, and you can see that hearing range is reduced. So soft sounds are really out of their hearing range. Loud sounds, they're going to hear some, and moderate sounds. And so we have to apply some amplification, but we have to fit all that to comfortably fit in that range. So we can program it. This is where they were listening to speech that was soft conversation. This was normal conversation. And this is their left ear. So everything above the line they're hearing. This is their right ear. This is their uncomfortable levels programmed in. And so this is the range that you're fitting in. This is pretty normal. It's meeting the targets. Because they have enough hearing loss, they're going to have difficulty with soft sounds. There's another thing on here that's really helpful, and I'm going to do that on the next screen. And you can see this number here. Oops. This number here is 72, and that's called a speech intelligibility index. And so if you look at 72 here and you say, how would they do with sentences? You can actually see that they would get 80-some%. So it's actually correlated the percent of speech intelligibility index with different types of word lists from some studies. And so you want to look for that as well, because this is telling you that they are listening to sound or how much loudness they have. but you also want to know how much audibility. So where are they getting the sounds where speech falls into, and how much of it are they getting? In this case, you can see that someone could look at this and say they're over amplified, but no, this is adjusted for the patient's preference. This is just another way. And this is, again, soft conversation, normal, and loud. And hearing aid fit orientation, it's really important. We're checking physical fit, reviewing the operation, everything, care and use, the goals, make sure we're setting expectations. If it's someone that we're doing our verification and they can't handle getting even close to target, and we have to let them adjust to sound, we may use acclimatization, and most hearing aids have a function for that. And then we need to go over phone use and then set their follow-up. They have a 30-day trial period. They're going to come back usually one other time during that, but definitely before the trial period. You're going to make whatever adjustments. We have data logging to combine with what they tell us to see what kind of situations have they been in. Some companies are better than others, but generally you can see how much time do they spend in loud or average environments. How often was the program switching? The program, as I mentioned, on a high-level hearing aid, it could switch into as many as 8 identities. And the question is it switching when it should? And so that can help tell you if you feel like, oh, you know, this should be switching more, or this is going into speech mode a lot, and they say they're in quiet, and I'm showing they're mostly in quiet, then we may have to adjust how the automated switching works. We're going to validate it. Again, validation is subjective, verification is objective. And so it's important to go over those goals and see if they met their outcomes, do the post-fitting hearing handicap, and then the follow-up plan. So sometimes it might be, you know, we need to still get you used to more sound. We think you're going to want more. Let's see you in 3 months. Sometimes it's, you know, we'll see you in 6 months, whatever is needed. Do I have enough time to do this very last part on over the counter?
Sure, go ahead.
I'm going to take that as a yes. Okay. So over the counter hearing aids is the latest, greatest, newest thing. And what that is, if we just go back to October 2015, PCAST, which is the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, they actually did a report. They studied accessibility of hearing aids, and I saw a fascinating discussion on it from one of the panelist members, and they really kind of bit off on that one, thinking it would be easy, and they found out it really was a hot mess. So they came up with 4 main recommendations. One is that the FDA should have a category for basic air conduction hearing aids for mild to moderate hearing loss, so kind of like over-the-counter prescription eyeglasses. They also said the FDA should withdraw their guidance on personal sound amplification products. Those are all those products that you see advertised in the, they're on store shelves. They're from $30 to $200 or $300. They don't meet any criteria. They've not been registered because they're calling themselves PSAPs. And they're not supposed to have a high gain. Some of them have higher than others because they're using that category to disguise themselves and not have to go through FDA approvals of the hearing aid. Then they also said the Federal Trade Commission should make the patient's audiograms and any hearing aid programming profiles available at no cost to patients or a hearing aid vendor. If a patient showed up there, they should be able to get that, and the FTC should define a process by which that could occur. So then in April of 2016, the NASEM, the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, they came out with their report and 12 recommendations. And it's a great report if you haven't read it. I'm not going to go over the 12 recommendations, but it was basically things related to accessibility, related to the fact that technology is, because of the expense of hearing aids and the expensive technology, that there isn't enough out there that's in a more costly category. So one of their recommendations, though, was that the FDA no longer enforce the requirement for medical evaluation prior to hearing aid purchase. And the FDA did cease enforcement of that requirement in December 2016. Now that means they're not going to come after you, but it doesn't mean you don't have to have it, because licensure laws generally lag behind, and they do require it. And there's questions still of should they have medical evaluation or not, and there's cases for both. So that's happened in 16. And and then the NASEM report, sorry, it identified barriers as awareness, cost, affordability, unclear pathway to care, and that, again, the 12 recommendations. Then that ended in a Senate bill, or a Senate bill for over-the-counter hearing aid act of 2017. So that one requires the FDA to provide a category for over-the-counter hearing aids, define the parameters so that it is still safe and effective, have available so that those can be available online in pharmacies, stores, or by mail order. They aim it at those with perceived mild to moderate hearing loss, recognizing that hearing loss greater than that has other issues and likely will need that. It spurs innovation, competition, and lower prices. Here's the first even though the category is not out yet, and they have until August 18th, I believe, to come up with it. Everyone thought it was going to come out at the end of last year, but then other things kind of took their time, or took their attention away from it. And so anyway, but they have approved the Bose hearphones, and this is not, Bose is going to they're working on some hearing aids, self-fit hearing aids, as will probably Samsung and other electronic companies, because that's sort of the aim of those, that bill, and that is to create competition and allow those that are really good sound engineers and that to kind of get in this market and give those entry-level products. But this was approved in October of 2018. I don't know exactly when it came out. It came out sometime last year, available to the market. You see it running anywhere from $300 to $400, depending what site you're on. And you wear this part around your neck, and then you put the buds in the ear. I think over-the-counter hearing aids are a good thing. I think it's going to get some of the people that could benefit from hearing aids, and we can get past that 20–30% penetration and get them into it and realize it's a good thing. We make it easier. But what we have to do is make sure that nobody looks at it as, oh, it's a hearing aid and it failed, I will never benefit from a hearing aid, because we can't go back to the door-to-door sales of the hearing aids. So with that, I stop, and I apologize for going over. I know no one was next, so.
That was great. Thank you very much. I think that was really useful. I think
I'm not
definitely improved my counseling of patients. Appreciate you giving that lecture.